Welcome to Sewing with Threads, the monthly podcast by the staff of Threads magazine. I'm your host, editor Sarah McFarland, and I'm joined by senior technical editor.
Hi, I'm Carol Frazier.
And our managing editor production.
Hi, I'm Janine Clegg.
And our special guest speaking with us remotely is Pamela Howard. Hi, Pamela.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, thank you so much for being with us, or virtually being with us.
Thank you for asking.
Pamela is a Threads digital ambassador, a blueprint instructor, pattern designer, a top alteration specialist, custom clothier, and a teacher who travels nationwide. She's also written several feature articles for Threads magazine. She's been sewing since she was 14 years old. And to find out more about her work, you can visit PamelasClosetinc.com. So, Pamela, every episode where we have a new guest, we have a few sort of get-to-know-you questions that we ask.
Great.
And the first one is, who taught you to sew?
Well, I was pretty lucky in that I had two neighbors. One was Mrs. Stewart across the street, and Mrs. Jefferson was two doors down. And when I was 14, my mother asked the question that would change, I guess, the rest of my life. Would you like to learn to sew? And they taught me whatever I needed to know. They were ready to answer any questions. And I was one of those little nerdy kids who loved arts and crafts and hand sewing and hand embroidery. And I started sewing Vogue patterns, any pattern, just right out of the box. And none of them ever said to me, oh, don't sew that because it's too hard. Because that is dependent upon you, not for somebody to tell you that something is too hard, because then you become afraid to do it. So by the time I was 15, I was already sewing for people and being paid for it. And when I was 16, I made my cousin Kim's wedding dress and my sister Paula, my middle sister, and my bridesmaids' gowns. And so everyone who attended the wedding loved the dresses. And one of the ladies worked with my mother at the time, and she said, well, I guess you all decided to go on and buy Kim's dress after all. And she said, no, Pam made that. And I guess the quality of it was good enough for them to think that it was purchased, at the time. And the zipper was in so straight because I am a nerdy kid. I was a nerdy kid, and it had to be straight. So they were just so surprised to see that was made by me. And then,
that's incredible.
It just went on and on and on from there.
I think it's so lovely that you still remember the ladies' names, too.
Oh, yeah. Always be grateful to them.
Pamela, what is your favorite sewing term?
I thought about that. Stabilize. Because there are a lot of places in a garment that need to be stabilized in order to control the fabric, in order to make it well. And also the second one, if you'll allow me to,
sure.
Pressing.
Pressing, yes.
So
because you don't have to be
important,
the best sewist in the world, but if you can press well, no one will know that you made it.
Can I throw in another question there, Sarah?
Oh, sure, Janine.
So how did you learn how to press well? Who taught you that?
Well, I think when I was a little girl, way back when in the horse and buggy days, when your mother would iron handkerchiefs for your dad, that kind of thing, that's what she started me out on. But when I started making clothes, there was something in me that felt that, and I'm sure that the two ladies also interjected some tips on that, to make sure that it was pressed well. Of course, all of us can overpress if we're getting too excited about something, but to press it just well enough that you don't have to send your garment to the dry cleaners to have that done really helps to make things look really great.
That's true. I remember when I was learning how to sew that, you sew a seam and you think, oh, that's good. And then my mother was kind of a stickler, and she taught me to press too. And it was almost like magic, where something that was like, that looks pretty good. Then you press it and it's like, oh my gosh, that looks really professional. I'm really good at this.
Yeah, it changes the whole thing. So yeah, those two things are very important as far as I'm concerned.
Pamela, what's your favorite fabric to sew?
I know it's very hot where I live, but I love wool because you can mold and shape it to just about any form that you want it to be in, and with the proper pressing tools, it'll stay. So that and any other natural fiber, um, silks, linens, and denim, cotton denim. I just love natural fibers, but I think wool is my favorite.
What are you currently sewing?
Um, in my head, I am sewing. Um, I've already made three. In between jobs, I would make this moto jacket that was in the March Berta style magazine. And I have fallen in love with it. And I've already made three. So I need to have at least two or three more. So that is the next thing that I will make.
All in different fabrics, I assume, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I'll send you pictures.
Oh, good.
Oh, good. And Pamela, what do you love most about sewing?
I think the thing that I've always loved, even from age 14, is that once I make something, it's the only one. Because no matter what you pay for a garment, no matter what store you go in, there's a rack full of several different sizes of that same garment in that same fabric. But the thing about sewing is you get to choose the fabric, you get to choose what you want to make it in. You make it for yourself, and there's not another one in the world like it, unless one of your students decides that they love it very much and they want the same fabric and they want to make it. So that has happened as well, but there's only one. That's what I like about it.
But it probably looks different on them because they're a different size and shape. So
Well,
it is
that's
unique.
true. Yeah. That's true.
Well, thank you, Pamela, for answering the questions. We're going to take a brief break here, and we'll be back in a moment. We're going to talk about fabric and pattern compatibility with Pamela.
Great.
Janine, do you know what September is?
I sure do. It's National Sewing Month.
And do you know we have a special giveaway planned with some wonderful sponsors? It's a nice thank you to our loyal audience.
The winner receives a prize package worth more than $1,100.
The prizes include precision cutting tools, a newly released sewing machine, a home sewing center, an online fashion design learning subscription, and gifts from Threads.
To enter, visit threadsmagazine.com.
Good luck! And we're back. We're talking today with Pamela Howard about how to choose the right fabric for a pattern. And this topic came up when I was emailing Pamela about the episode and how I like the episodes to be informative and our listeners to actually learn something. And Pamela mentioned that that was a challenge that she saw many sewers having, that they would make something and the fabric would be too stiff or just the wrong choice so that they were disappointed in the final garment. Pamela, has this ever happened to you yourself?
Oh, yeah, plenty of times, in the journey of learning to sew and deciding which pattern to make and what fabric to use. One thing that we have to realize, and I'm talking to myself whenever I say this to anyone as well, is that the pattern companies have been doing this a really long time. And they have suggestions on the back of the pattern as to what to start with in order to make that particular design look like they have pictured on the front. They have alternatives, excuse me, for you to use as well. And as you get to know fabrics a little better, you can change out or veer away from what they suggest, as long as you know that what you choose is going to work. But that takes a little practice too. But what I found teaching is that some people would come to class with whatever they wanted to make already cut out, and it wasn't anything like what was suggested on the back of the pattern. And they ended up throwing it away or giving it away because it didn't work, because it wasn't anything like the fabric that was suggested to them. the one thing that I have found over the years of making clothes and or altering clothes for women is that the more curves you have, the softer the fabric should be. Um,
Oh, that's a good
Say you're
point.
making
Yes.
a suit jacket and you want it to make it into a menswear suiting because that's what you saw on the front of the pattern envelope. But if you're curvy, then a wool crepe or a crepe like fabric would be better for you because it would fall softer along your curves than a stiffer, harder finished fabric would, like a gabardine or a menswear suiting. Um, Say that you have a lapel, and right as it falls down the body toward the waist, if it's a crisp fabric, you may get peaks in the fabric, it stands out. If it's a softer fabric, it will form along your body. So that it's just, um, it makes you look better. It's more appealing. Um, and so if you would take the time to figure out what will work for you, I think people would have much more success.
That's actually interesting advice that you give about the lapels, because I think a lot of people who are curvier or maybe have a fuller bust stay away from lapels and things because of that problem where they kind of, in a sort of pointy way, kind of fold away from the body.
Yes.
And then they just think, I can't wear that at all. But if they choose a different fabric, maybe they have more styles available to them.
Yes, I think so. And as we've talked about before, proportion, length, all of that ties in to any and all of that. So um, uh, I remember going to an ASG event locally, and there was a lady there who chose either a corduroy or a velveteen to make a top and a pair of pants for herself. And it looked great, but in my mind, I thought, well, I wonder if you had chosen a crepe like or a softer, what I call squishy fabrics
Yeah.
instead of the harder ones like gab, wool gab or poly gab, then it would have gracefully gone over her hip, maybe better. But that was just my opinion. She was happy with it. I didn't say anything. And she looked great. So, and that's something, ladies, I would never do, um, is say to a person who sews, don't you think you could have chosen a better fabric or a different fabric?
Yeah. The what is that? The cow's already out of the barn at that point. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
we're already self-conscious about, our making clothes for ourselves. We're harder on ourselves than we are if
Yeah.
we went to purchase it. And I think that people should always be complimentary to people. And if they ever ended up in a class, then I would guide them more toward fabric that might work better for them. But it's ultimately their own choice.
So do you sometimes see ready-to-wear that you think has been incorrectly fabricated, that where they've chosen the wrong fabric for the garment that they're trying to sell?
Yes. I do a lot of alterations for the ladies here in town for Carlisle, Worth. If you've ever heard of those brands that they sell
Yes.
through representatives. And all of the fabric comes from uh, Italy or somewhere in Europe, from what I've been told. And they're using a lot of these techno fabrics, microfibers, and um, they don't always work for all body shapes. The garments are beautiful, but they don't always work. So what my job is to make it fit a little better on them so it looks more custom. But if that's what they want to purchase and they are beautiful, then I just try to make them fit a little better.
Sure, sure. I do find sometimes, though, that when looking at yardage, I tend to go for a more substantial fabric than. So sometimes I like to go and look at very nice ready to wear, and I'm like, oh, I could use a lighter fabric for a blouse in that style. It just, as a yardage, I always feel that it needs to have a little more heft And I have to kind of talk myself into using flimsier, lighter weight fabrics.
Oh, see, I was thinking it might be the other way, that people tend to go for stuff that's lightweight and flowy and pretty and then try to make something structured out of it. And then you're left with a, clingy sort of see-through-ish, not very flattering garment.
Mm-hmm. That's true. It just doesn't happen to be my
That's not your foible.
Yeah, but that's a good point. Yes.
Yeah. And Sarah, I think especially beginner sewers, they know that more stable fabrics, heavier fabrics, are easier to sew, usually.
Exactly.
Not always, but, they may tend toward choosing those when they're purchasing. Pamela, what do you think of that?
I totally agree with you. It doesn't slip and slide around as much when you're
Yes.
beginning to sew. And so your natural tendency is to go towards something that is going to be more stable as you sew it. And then you find out it doesn't look so great on you
Yeah.
after sewing it. But, as you get more experience, you decide to go to a fabric that might be a little more challenging. And a good place to start if you're an intermediate sewer is, like you said, you look at that better ready to wear. I always tell people to go into stores that they might not necessarily be able to afford the garments, but you get a good look at what the current styles are, the current colors, the silhouettes, and then you can refer back to the pattern catalogs because you'll find a shape that is very similar to that garment, and then you can adapt and make whatever it is you see.
Mm-hmm.
But, as you go along your sewing journey, it just tends to get better, and there's a lot more information out there than it was when I was growing up with YouTube and also, especially Threads magazine, with all of the great articles and pictures that you all take of the garments and in different stages of them being made. So you get to get a lot more information than was available to me and all of us when we were growing up.
I wonder if it's more difficult these days to choose fabric because a lot of the fabric is available online only, and you can't touch it. You don't see it in person. And while there are photos of the fabrics, the yardage online, it's not always your screen display might be different. Your colors might be slightly different than the actual color, and you may not get a sense of the weight of the fabric. Is it harder to choose fabric, I wonder, these days because most of the retailers are online?
I think it is a bit more difficult. The great thing, the other side of that is if you're not so anxious, you can ask them to send you a swatch. It's not a huge swatch, or you can order the minimal amount from that particular company so that you can get at least an eighth of a yard if they're willing to sell that. And then you can hold it in your hand and you can see the colors and the different color variations throughout if it's a print. You're able to get that kind of information now if you're willing to wait for a swatch to come. I think the problem that most of us have is that we're so excited we just pull the trigger and go on and order the fabric, and we're disappointed once we get it. But if you're patient enough, any and all of those will give a decent description of the fabric and maybe what it could be used for. So that really helps me a lot, and I hope it helps everyone else.
Yes, I love to be able to do that. And there were, a lot of the fabric providers will give you a little rebate for your swatch purchase if you eventually buy some fabric. So that's good. Pamela, I was wondering about, you mentioned how the pattern envelopes have fabric suggestions. Sometimes I see that there are new fabrics available in the fabric store, some of these more high-tech fabrics, but I don't know that the pattern companies have caught up with the availability of new fabrics. It seems that they keep suggesting the same very classic fabrics, and I wondered if you had any thoughts on that. Have you noticed that?
I have noticed that. I think that they are kind of going with the status quo, things that they have printed on the backs of their pattern envelopes for many years. And you're right, some of these new fabrics that aren't described on the pattern envelope um, could definitely be used. But again, you're going to have to get a swatch of it, or at least an eighth of a yard of it, to see how it compares to maybe a wool gabardine, or how it compares to a file um, for blouse weights, or how it would compare to if the older patterns. A lot of people are buying these older
Oh,
vintage
that's
patterns, and
another wrinkle that there are the
they may
older
say
patterns.
ottoman, and they don't really know what that means. But um, the great thing again is the information that's on the web now. You can type in certain words and they'll give a description, and if it doesn't click with you as to what they really mean, then getting that swatch really will help you.
Yeah, I think there has been a little bit of updating because I would say that they're starting to recommend things like stretch wovens and ponte knits that were not recommended years, even in probably 10 years ago when those would have been available and also appropriate for a lot of things. And now you do see that on pattern envelopes because those fabrics are really ubiquitous at this point in, for sewers and also in ready to wear. And I think people like to wear them because they have a nice structure, but also some give. So you will see that recommended.
And I see a greater range suggested with the cosplay and costume patterns.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, you see scuba all the time.
Oh, right, yeah. Oh, that's right. Well, scuba's got its magic properties.
Well,
I think
the other thing too is that Carol, you even noticed this when you were preparing a question and answer department for a previous issue, that the names of fabrics are different depending on maybe sometimes where you are in the country or where you are in the world.
Or where you are in time. Pamela just mentioned ottoman, and as far as I know, ottoman used to be a woven fabric with a sort of a horizontal rib. Correct,
that's
Pamela?
correct. Yes, that's it.
But I would say about 10 or 15 years ago, there was a very easily accessible knit fabric that had that same rib, and it had about the same amount of stretch as ponte knit maybe, or like a double knit, and people just called that ottoman. It's completely different and can be used very differently from the old woven ottoman. So if you saw that name, you wouldn't really know what was being referred to and which was the appropriate fabric.
That's true. That's true. I went into our local Joann's one day and asked the manager if she had bengaline,
Oh, yeah.
which is similar to ottoman, smaller rib.
Yeah.
And she didn't know it. She had to look it up, and they actually did have some there.
And was it like the bengaline that is sort of the old version? I mean, nowadays I think that there's some people sell a woven fabric with a sort of a straight grain stretch as bengaline.
Oh, I don't think I've seen any of that.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's why there's such a lot of confusion because it's actually fantastic. You can cut pants on the cross grain and get these really great stretch pants that look like a crisp woven.
Style Arc.
Yes,
Style Arc.
Yes,
that's right. That's right.
But yeah, that's not the same as what bengaline might have been in the past, or what you might find in other places.
That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, knits in particular, I feel are confusing in a lot of fabric stores. You may have a pattern with a stretch guide on it, but the fabrics aren't often clearly described, and knits can have very different weights.
Yes.
Yes. Pamela, what kind of guidance do you offer your students? You just did a blog post for us about putting buttonholes in knits. And what kind of guidance do you offer your students about choosing knit fabrics for particular patterns?
I suggest that they buy more stable knits because if they're new to it, they would get very frustrated sewing the very stretchy ones.
Yes.
And those look great on everyone's body. The pontes, they have varying degrees of rayon or not rayon or all poly. Just look on the end of the bolt and for them to tell you what the fiber content is. And I think also one thing to remember, and that I tell them, is to check the amount of give or stretch in it. It's a wonderful thing that they have added Lycra into these fabrics. But you have to make sure of how it's going to fit you if it's extra stretchy as opposed to moderately stretchy. But also the stitch to use, which is easier to pick out than one that is the lightning stitch, maybe. I learned early on when I got a machine that had the lightning stitch. I was very excited about sewing knits with it, and then I got very upset because if I made a mistake, I
Oh,
couldn't get it
you can't
out.
pick it out.
Yes,
Yeah.
that has definitely happened to me. Yes.
Well, is there a danger in using a knit that has more stretch than is recommended?
You just have to go down a size.
Uh-huh.
If
Okay.
it's very stretchy, because it will end up larger on you than you may want it to be. So when I'm doing classes, I suggest that they put the garment together except for the side seams, and then we can drape fit to make sure that we
Okay.
get the fit and feel and size that they need, and then cut away the excess.
Is this also where your favorite word stabilize comes in?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Well, I was thinking about that too, Janine, because Pamela, have you ever been able to sort of save a garment that was perhaps going to be made in a fabric that was a little light for the design or a little slinky for the design by stabilizing the fabric?
I certainly have. In fact, one of those jackets that I was telling you about, the Berta
Yes.
Moto jacket, I made it in a silk matka type fabric. And I noticed after I'd gotten the collar on, facing everything on, that the collar was a little bit too limp, but I had not connected it to the lining and closed it up. So what I did was I went back in and cut another collar or upper collar or under collar in interfacing, and I laid it in so that I could fuse it on to make it heavier. And so that saved the entire jacket.
That's a great save.
Yeah, that's a good
because you'd
save.
gotten
Yeah.
pretty far into it and you were still able to save it.
Oh, you should have seen my face. It was not pretty. It was not pretty. But we saved it. And I remember another jacket that I had made that was a very, well, the wax print
Yeah.
fabrics.
Yes.
And I made one of my favorite jean jackets, and I realized that I didn't stabilize the collar enough. So the save for that to stabilize it was to cut another collar, fold in the seam allowances all around, and fell stitch it to the under collar so that it added an extra amount of weight to it, and it saved that jacket as well.
I am so encouraged to
I
hear
know.
this.
Those are great saves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, if I get to that stage with things, I just think, oh, it's over now. There's nothing to be done.
No. She's just warming up in the wings. She hadn't sung yet. So
Pamela, I was also thinking about fabric preparation. And have you ever had a fabric with a hand or a texture that changed drastically after you had washed it? I do think about that with, say, a waxed cotton. Is it going to be different after I've cared for it in the way that I'm going to eventually care for the garment?
the majority of the things that I make, I do not pre-treat it because I think I'm going to then dry clean the garment, especially that wax cotton jacket. I knew that if I washed it, some of the sheen was going to go away.
Yes.
And I liked the natural sheen. Now, there's one fabric that I will wash on occasion ahead of making it, and that is a silk dupioni. And I know that
Oh,
some
yes.
of the sheen is going to go away and some of the crispness, but that's what I want. I made a shirt that I wanted it. I wanted not to be as crisp, or I did an underlining in something and I wanted it to be softer. So I washed it ahead of time. So anytime that you're concerned about that, it's good to take a swatch and maybe serge around it, especially if it's a fabric that ravels quite a bit
Oh, yes.
because you don't want to get it out of the washer and then into the dryer and you have nothing. So to pre-test to see if it's going to look like you want it to look in the garment after you've made it. So it's always good to not be too anxious, but pre-test. I always say test first.
We
So that's
frequently
just
say
my
that in
thought.
articles as well.
That's true. I think that's it. Yes, Janine has this thing. She's the last person to see every article before it goes out, and so I think at the end of each one, she adds somewhere in there, test everything before you
Oh yeah,
do it to the final
yeah.
product.
Right. Or make a
It'll
Muslim
save your
first.
life.
Oh, sure. We're getting close to the end of our time, but I was thinking it might be a good idea to do sort of a checklist for beginning or intermediate sewers about what we've talked about. So definitely look at what the pattern recommends. And Pamela, you said you can order swatches,
Yes.
serge, and test a swatch if you're going to be washing it. There are possibilities to save garments with stabilizers.
And
See, anything
intermediate
else?
sewers begin with something a little bit more stable, not so, not too squishy or too stretchy or anything.
Exactly. And but check out high-end ready-to-wear if you want
yes.
some ideas.
And consider your body shape and size to help you determine what type of fabric would be best for your figure.
Yeah,
Yes.
and I think that the implied here always was don't necessarily think it has to be the exact same fabric that's on the pattern envelope. If that's not your body type, think beyond that a little bit.
Yeah. Yes. Exactly. Yeah. Okay.
And can
so,
I interject one more thing?
Oh yes, please.
I would say that I've had a lot of students to say that they want to sew for themselves, but they want to change sizes first. They want to lose
Oh.
a specific amount of weight before they make it. And I say, so you're not going to leave the house, or what's going on with you? You have to feel good enough about yourself that you will make clothes at no matter what size you happen to be. Because we make clothes for ourselves, we don't put size tags in them. So there's no one who's going to sneak and look at the back collar to see what size you made. And I remember having a student who told me that she worked for Donna Karan one summer. And whatever size Donna Karan happened to be at that time, before that new collection, that was the size 10. So
Okay.
whatever size you want to put in it. I mean, I even some of my clients who buy from those companies I mentioned earlier, some of the reps will order smaller size tags to put into the garments because the person doesn't want to say they wear a 10, or they don't want to say they wear a 12. They want to say they wear an 8. So they'll change them out for them.
Wow.
But we've got to wear clothes, ladies.
We do. We do. That's another wonderful reason to sew for yourself. You'll have something
That's right.
totally unique, and the size is you. It's not a number.
Right.
Oh, yeah. It's whatever size you want to make that fits you, and I'm not telling.
Yeah, and you gave a good piece of advice when you were talking about if you're making something with a slightly more stable knit or any kind of knit, put it on and don't do the side seams until you have most of it together, and then you can customize the side seams for a really good fit. And if you think you're going to lose 20 pounds after that, I suppose you can go back in and take the side seams in a little bit more as you go down. And so, you've built some changeability into the garment.
Yes. And personally, my weight fluctuates, but I found that the garments that I've fit, even if I go down or up in size, they are fitted to certain idiosyncrasies my body has, and they still fit better than anything that I could pick up off a rack. Yeah.
Yeah, you should feel
Okay.
good about yourself no matter what size you happen to live in at the moment.
Yes. To close the episode, we have a question, and this is from Janine. It's a restyling question.
Okay.
Janine, you have this beautiful blouse.
I have, yes. I just actually bought this blouse. It's a very lightweight cotton and silk blend. And the blouse has a very long ruffle on the bottom edge on the hem. It's probably 8 inches, maybe.
Do you want to hold it up?
Sure. And the ruffle is not flattering on me. I wanted to go with a more of a straighter look on the bottom.
Okay.
Because it's a little overwhelming for me. And I'm kind of looking for suggestions on how to restyle this. The top of the blouse has lace insets, and it does have some machine embroidery that is mirrored on the bottom, machine embroidery across the top
And
of
some,
the bodice.
it looks like some tucks too.
Yes.
Lots of detail.
Right. There are like 6 tucks, I think, across or down the front. So, and also along the 3/4 sleeves. So I'm looking for a restyling. Anybody, any thoughts for me on this?
My very first thought was that the ruffle was too deep for the overall scale of the top and for you. So I would shorten the ruffle. And I was wondering about where that seam hits on your body, Janine.
Yes, I think it's above the waist, slightly above the waist or at the waist. So it looks more like a long top. But see, that's why I didn't want to just cut it off, because I thought it would be too short for me. I'm a little beyond the age of wearing a crop top.
And I think my suggestion would be similar to Sarah's. Maybe make the bottom part of it not so wide. It's about 8 inches. Maybe make it about 5 or 6, but also take it off and remove all the ruffle entirely. I mean, don't gather it. Just put it on straight so that it just comes down like a nice little tunic. And you could also do it. You could do it. Maybe not even have side seams. Just finish it, and so you have kind of a vent on the side. So that you sew a little bit to the front and then sew some to the back. You could even overlap them a tiny bit if you wanted to. So there's a little bit of ease over the hips. Janine does not need ease over her hips, even though that's something that it occurs to me frequently. But I think you could do that. If you wanted to, you could put a little waistband around it instead and have it like a blouson top. But I think you might have wanted to wear this as an over blouse or more tunic style.
Yes, and I think the fullness is what was bothering me about the bottom portion.
Yeah.
Well, that was my suggestion, is to remove the gathers, put it on as a straight band so it looks more like a tunic. And just like Carol said, you could either put splits on the sides or split on one side. But the thing that's very important is to make sure that it hits your body at the right proportion. It's 3/4 sleeves, so when you put your arms down, just make sure that whatever the length is not equal to where the sleeve stops.
Yeah, don't have that seam at the same point where the sleeve
Right.
stops. Okay.
Right.
Yes, good idea. Absolutely. Maybe that was what the problem was when I tried it on, that seam was landing there. So I'll take another closer look.
And I don't think we want the top overall to end at that point either.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
well, Janine, you'll have to model this.
Okay.
After the episode, we'll do some pinning.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Pamela, and thank you, Carol.
Thank you,
That was good.
ladies.
Yeah.
Thank you, Pamela. Thank you so much for being on with us. We'll talk to you soon. I know you've got digital ambassador posts coming up for us, and hopefully some articles too.
Yes, ma'am, I certainly do. And thank you for inviting me again. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening. Follow Threads on social media and visit threadsmagazine.com to view show notes for this episode. While you're on the site, check out Threads Insider, our online membership with exclusive access to expert sewing techniques. Until next time, keep on sewing with Threads.